morning. I would like to call to order the July 10th meeting of Indiana State Board of Education. Roll call, please.
Present.
Here. Here.
Here.
Here.
Present.
Here.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Welcome again, and I do have a couple of amendments to the agenda. If we could move discussion item A prior to new business and after consent agenda. Move consent item C to action item E, and move consent item H to discussion item E.
So moved.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Statement of the chair. I usually keep this brief. Apologize in advance. I do want to start with Leanne. This is Leanne's last meeting with us. I board with her in her role at the department and in her role in the governor's office, and you, every decision that you make, you put kids first. I'm happy for you. I'm happy for Muncie, but I'm sad for us. So I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. So thank you. We also have the Governor's Teacher Pay Commission has 3 community sessions, input sessions coming up. August 19th will be in Indianapolis. August 24th will be in Evansville, and August 27th will be in Elkhart. I just wanted to share that. And we also have some new members with us. So if you would, I will let you, William, we will start with you, sir. If you will just introduce yourself, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is William Durham Jr. I am a native of Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm educated in Pike Township. I have spent the last 12 or so years working in the field of education. Started off as a Title I math instructor, then transitioned to exceptional learners instructor, became a lead teacher in the math department for the Excel Center, and then for the past 3 years, I've been the school director for the Excel Center.
Thank you. Welcome. Pat, you're up, sir.
My name's Pat Mates. I'm the superintendent of Perry Township Schools. Getting ready to start my 33rd year in education. Been a teacher, a coach, middle school principal, high school principal, assistant superintendent, director of the licensing for state of Indiana, assistant superintendent of public instruction over operations, and the chairman of the Education Employment Relations Board. So there's pretty much nothing in education I don't think I've done at this point in time. And I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues here on the board and giving a perspective of a current superintendent who's dealing with this each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, I'm Pete Miller. I'm really excited to be a part of this team. I think I have a bit of a unique background. I spent 6 years in the Indiana Office of Management and Budget at the time when we passed dollars to the classroom. I was a big part of implementing that. Spent a term in the state legislature and the Senate representing Hendricks and Putnam counties, and on the education committee. And I would say in the legislature, you kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of the policy areas, and this is the policy area I care most about, so I'm excited about diving in a lot deeper here. And also my day job, I do data analytics, so my understanding is you deal with data here.
Every now and
Looking
then.
forward to bringing those talents to bear.
Well, welcome.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Rentschler. I have been in public education for 20 years, 18 of those at Columbia City High School as a history teacher. I have three kids at home, one in a private high school, one in a public high school, and one just out of diapers. In the midst of all of that, I have done a little bit of work teaching at Huntington University as an adjunct professor. So I'm hoping my different experiences as a mom and a teacher in different realms will help bring something to the board.
Thank you
Thank
very much, and welcome. Okay, board member comments.
Just real quickly, I just want to send out some kudos. I had a chance a week ago to do a little bit of visiting with some schools and different folks up in the northern part of the state. And one of the things that I would suggest to anyone, that if you have the opportunity to go to the Renaissance District in the old Studebaker factory, that is really, really cool what they've done with that. And there's educational pieces in there. Purdue Polytech's in there. They're working on a few other educational spaces in there as well. But for a building that went out of use the year I was born in '63, it was kind of cool to be in there with that history. And they're still using the electrical facilities that they had. There are companies that are doing research with 50 amp, 3-phase that's still in there from the time that factory closed. And I just think that's really cool. Kudos to them on what they've done up there. And then also to Plymouth School Corporation hosted me in the morning to have some conversations about things. And Albert Hanselman up there, we had some great talks and learned what's going on with Plymouth, and with that CTE cooperative that they have with 10 schools up there. And so I guess Andy Hartley's the superintendent and Albert is the CTE director. And then also spent some time at Heartland Career Center with them, and Mark Hobbs is their CTE director, doing some great work with some new ag specialists and precision agriculture pathways that they're working on. And so had the chance to sit in on some of that, and it was good to get my hands into some of those things. But just wanted to give some kudos to some things that are going on out in the schools and that. Thanks.
Good. Awesome, thanks, sir. Anyone else? Boys?
BJ, I need to echo your remarks about Leanne. I've worked with Leanne at the department and in her different roles that she's had throughout her time in education, and Muncie Community Schools is my old stomping grounds, and they're very, very fortunate to have somebody like Leanne lead them through this journey they've been on as they're trying to right their ship, and she's the right person to help them to get there in a good community that needs a great leader, and now they've received one.
Anything else? Board comments? Okay, public comment?
Good morning. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. My name is Brent Kent, and I'm the CEO of a nonprofit based here in Indianapolis called Foster Success. I spoke to you at the April board meeting about the Foster Youth Education Outcomes Report, the first like it in the state of Indiana, in fact, the first like it in the country. Our organization works with older foster youth who have or are likely to age out of the foster care system without permanent families. And our goal is that by age 25, we surround them with supports and programs to help them make that transition to adulthood on their own successfully. We brought legislation to the legislature last year with the goal of improving education outcomes for foster youth, because we see the lack of a quality K-12 education is the biggest hurdle to their ultimate success. We run programs in post-secondary to prepare them for college, to help them fund college, to furnish their dorm rooms. And what we often see is, even with our summer bridge programs and our college preparation programs, that foster youth graduating high school are not prepared for the rigors of remedial English or remedial math. So we asked that for the first time, Indiana begin tracking foster youth education outcomes. That culminated in a report released in April that showed us, among other things, that only 64% of Indiana's foster youth, our most vulnerable children, are graduating high school, about a fifth of those with a graduation waiver, compared to about 8% of their peers. we saw that about 21% are expelled or suspended from school each year, compared to, again, about 8% of the peers. And the disparity was even greater for students of color in the foster care system. That same law required that by June 30th of this year, the first state-level plan to improve education outcomes for foster youth would be submitted to the state board. I believe that's an item on the agenda. I think Indiana has such a great opportunity right now. This is the first time that this level of data has been available in the country. Our organization has heard from other states and national organizations looking to replicate this in their states and at the federal level. And I think that this remediation plan is an opportunity for the Indiana Department of Education to lead in developing a model, the first model, to support foster children in our K-12 schools. There was, in the last year that we have data available, approximately 20,000 school-aged children in the foster care system in Indiana. And I think that we can learn a great deal about how to educate and support other students, at-risk subgroups, and students impacted by trauma if we can muster the political will to create a robust and meaningful plan of action to improve education outcomes for foster kids. Now, imagine 20,000 children and their contributions to our communities, their gifts, their workforce potential that we may not realize if we don't get this right. So I appreciate and I'm encouraged by the department's assembling a stakeholder coalition to move forward on developing a plan. But my hope is that the department will include in the plan to complete a plan a submission of a robust and meaningful plan at a later date. Thank you.
Brent, if I could,
Yes.
I consider you probably the leading expert in the state on this, so I want to preface that with that. That's why I have questions for you, and usually we don't do questions here, but I have to ask.
In absence of
What-
someone else, maybe, yes.
What do you feel like the plan is missing, if it's missing anything?
Well, if we were considering it an actionable plan of action for schools for the 2019-2020 school year, there's really nothing in it actionable. The stakeholders did meet in May. We had a meeting, we brainstormed, and the notes from that meeting, I think, are what constitute the plan submitted. If you consider the plan as a plan to develop a plan, which I think these stakeholders were in agreement that we would move forward together in developing a plan, then I think how it can be strengthened would be including a final submission date for when a plan would be submitted. I think the only deliverable in the plan is recommendations to the Commission on Improving the Status of Children next month. I'm not sure what those recommendations would be unless it's the submission of, again, these meeting notes. So I think it could be strengthened with having a deadline for the submission of a meaningful plan.
Are there any more meetings scheduled for stakeholders to discuss developing the plan?
I think right now those meetings are being scheduled. I think with the plan, this plan to create a plan calls for is meeting every other month, and I think that might start this month. So I really do think, though, by the end of the year, we could and should plan to submit something that is more robust and meaningful than what is being submitted right now. Thank you.
Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Dakota Huddleston. I am a teacher in Columbus, Indiana. I wanted to start today by thanking Dr. McCormick. I have appreciated her in the role as our elected superintendent of our education, and I deeply appreciate her advocacy on part of public education and her attempts to make sure that our schools are being funded appropriately. I'm here today to express a couple of thoughts. My first one is that I'm very upset and frustrated with the structure of this board. With the loss of the election of our superintendent of education, we have essentially lost educators, community members, everyone in Indiana have lost their voice on state educational policy. This board is appointed by the governor mainly, and I know that a lot of you then have connections to the governor, and so I do believe that this body should be an elected body if we're not going to have the ability to elect our state superintendent. Secondly, I understand that on the agenda today, we have discussion of charter school funds, overseeing virtual schools, quite a lot of hot topic issues that educators have been paying a lot of attention to over the last couple of years. And while we have not made our voices heard, that is certainly going to be changing going forward. And I wish that this body would look at what is happening to our public school system and stand up for our public schools and for our educators. I understand that as this body, you do not control state funding of education. That's not your prerogative and you don't get say over that. However, you do have a lot of influence over education in this state. You have a lot of connections, and I wish that I could see some leadership from our State Board of Education stepping out and saying that we do need more funding and that we do need our public schools to be supported that take every student, and that we should back off on vouchers whenever they have been proven to cause student achievement learning loss, which is kind of unusual for any education reform, or back off on charter schools for a little while because they have been shown to greatly exacerbate racial segregation in education. And I hope that we can see that kind of leadership from the rest of the state board going forward. We have seen it from Dr. McCormick, and I urge you all to follow her lead. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Alistair Lute. I'm from MSD of Decatur Township. At 11 months old, I entered into the foster system. I was one of the lucky ones. I had people who were there to help me, support me, and were able to save me. But the damage at that point was done. The wounds were there, and they would never heal. From an early age, I became involved in self-harm, substance abuse, and whatever else I could find to numb the pain. Even with more support than many foster children have, I had a higher likelihood of suicide, less than a 3% chance at earning a college degree, and only 50% chance of graduating from high school. As a foster child, there was one place I knew I was safe. That one place I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, people cared about me. That place was our public school system. As a student, I knew every day I was at school, someone cared about me. I was in a place where I was safe. The inconsistencies and the trauma I experienced at home were nothing but a memory. However, many legislators are systematically dismantling public education. As money is siphoned off, public education suffers. As public education suffers, so do our students. Our students with special needs, those who are abused and those who need a safe place. As we sacrifice public education, we sacrifice our most vulnerable students. Teachers don't do this to get rich. We enter this field to help students. However, our educators are paid 21.4% less than similarly educated, experienced professionals. Too often, educators who dedicate their lives to children struggle to support their own families, and these educators must take on second and even third jobs. It's not right, and it shortchanges our students, it shortchanges public education, and demoralizes these dedicated professionals. With this climate for teachers, we cannot recruit and retain the committed, qualified educators that our students deserve. The public supports educators. The last PDK poll shows that 2/3 of Americans believe that teachers' salaries are too low. Indiana ranks below the national average and fails to compete with nearly all neighboring states in funding for public schools. Indiana teacher salaries are below average compared to the nation and again, are lower than neighboring states. I was able to break the cycle. I was able to graduate with college with a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and 4 teaching licenses across 2 states. I did this because of support from teachers like Mr. Nafis in high school. Teachers who had funding that allowed them to focus on broken students like me. Teachers who came in on Saturdays to tutor to give me one more safe place. How can we do this if we're forced to work 2 or 3 jobs? I fear that if Indiana continues on this path of siphoning funding away from public schools toward failing charter and virtual schools under the guise of school choice, while failing to pay teachers quality salaries, we will do so by sacrificing our most vulnerable, our children. I hope the Board of Education will join me in the Red for Ed movement in calling for stronger public school funding and better pay for teachers. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
I'd actually put myself in as talking before Indiana Virtual School. Is it okay? Would you
We'll
provide?
do it on the action item?
I'm
Yeah,
happy to talk
absolutely.
either
No,
time.
that is fine.
You want me to wait?
We'll wait, if that's okay with you.
Then I'll prepare.
Thank you. You want to do? Perfect. That's it, everything else? Okay, that will conclude public comment. Consent agenda, we have approval of teacher licensing test vendor, assignment of school numbers, freeway accreditation waivers, latchkey waivers, common school loans, appointment of the executive director, resolution regarding charter authorizer hearings, initiate rulemaking for 511 IC 6.2-3.1, I read 3, or initiate rulemaking IC 20-19-8, SB 567 virtual schools, state tuition support withholding for turnaround academies, Gary Community Schools, and Indianapolis Public Schools.
Move approval.
Before we do that, if we may, I am going to recuse myself from consent item F because I work for the Evansville Vanderburgh School Corporation and they're receiving a common, school loan. So I will not,
BJ, I'm recusing from part L2.
okay.
Move approval. Second.
I have a motion and a second for consent agenda. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Now we have up, we are going to kindergarten pilot program. We're going to do discussion item A prior to new business. So Claire, welcome.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Hey, I get it.
While we're in transition, I just want to take opportunity to congratulate our new executive director,
Absolutely.
Brian Murphy. He's done an outstanding job over a number of years here, and I'm very excited for you.
Yeah. Ditto. Welcome.
Very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us with you here today. I'm going to start, provide a little bit of context, and then turn things over to my colleague here, Dr. Mark Hernandez, who drove down this morning from Chicago, from the University of Chicago. So first, my name is Claire Fidian Green. I'm president and CEO of the Richard M. Fairbanks Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation in Indianapolis. And our mission is to advance the vitality of Indianapolis and the well-being of its people. One of our core focus areas is education, and a priority within that area is ensuring that children in Marion County are ready for kindergarten. So that is one of the areas in which our foundation does award grant funding. Someone who is not with us today, but who has been a huge part of this work is Kevin Bain, who is the former CEO of the Wellborn Baptist Foundation in Evansville. He retired at the end of last year. He also served as the chair of Indiana's Early Learning Advisory Committee, ELAC, for 4 years. So is steeped in the On My Way pre-K, pilot, and all things early childhood education. So he sends his regards, but he was unable to join us today. So a little bit of context. In early 2016, Kevin and I met to brainstorm ways that our two foundations might help further the success of On My Way pre-K. Marion County is our focus area. His foundation's focused in Vanderburgh County, and those were the two largest counties in the pilot at that time. And one of the things that Kevin was aware of from his time on the ELAC was that there did not exist a perfect instrument or really a good instrument for telling us whether our children are ready for kindergarten. And since that's a focus for our foundation and also for Wellborn Baptist Foundation, we thought, is there something that we could do with philanthropy to try to help support the pilot activity in Marion and Vanderburgh counties? So in addition, Kevin had chaired the subcommittee of the ELAC that was supposed to select an assessment for On My Way pre-K, and at that time they had to put together a combination of 3 different assessments in order to meet the legislative requirements, but there was a charge to go forth and develop the iStar KR, which was an instrument that Indiana had developed, and expand that to be a pre-K assessment. So that was the decision made when we had this conversation in 2016. So we said, why don't we scan the country and find a leading expert in early childhood education and challenge them with, can we actually develop an assessment that is less than 20 minutes long that would measure direct measures of the academic readiness of children to complement what was being developed by the state, which was going to include social and emotional learning indicators of readiness. So that's the context. The KRI, Kindergarten Readiness Indicators, what it is a brief assessment of literacy, oral language, and math skills for use by Indiana pre-K providers. Its key features is that it's about 15 to 20 minutes to administer. It's optimized for use on mobile devices and is easy to use. It uses direct measures versus being dependent on teacher observation. It is aligned with the Early Learning Development Framework Foundations for Indiana, and it has been subjected to rigorous statistical validation. It was developed by NORC, and Dr. Hernandez here will talk to you in just a moment about what they have developed with funding from the Fairbanks Foundation and the Wellborn Baptist Foundation in Evansville, totaling a little over $500,000. And as part of that, we negotiated a royalty-free license that could be transferred to the state of Indiana in perpetuity for use of this instrument so that it would require no public dollars for development or licensing fees. So that is the KRI, and then Dr. Hernandez is going to tell you a little bit more about him and what we've developed.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm Mark Hernandez. I'm a principal research scientist at NORC and the director of our Early Childhood Research and Practice Collaborative. And I represent an organization, research organization, NORC at the University of Chicago, which is an independent not-for-profit research organization with national scope. We have been working closely since 2010 with our colleagues at the university to develop a larger formative assessment system that assesses oral language literacy and math in English and for Spanish dual language learners with funding from a number of foundations that is meant to be implemented 3 times a year to help directly inform practice. So a very authentic form of direct assessment for preschool teachers. And a few years ago, around 2017, I would say 16 or 17, the foundations approached us and said, we understand that you have this assessment. Would it be possible to adapt your formative assessment to create a kindergarten readiness assessment? And the answer to that was, well, kind of. The assessment wasn't designed to be a summative assessment that could be administered at the end of the year, but it was possible to adapt the Getting on Track assessment to do that. And the charge, as Claire mentioned, was to create an assessment that could be administered at the end of preschool. It could be accomplished in a 15 to 20 minute period of time, and assessing as many skills within the early learning foundations as accurately, reliably, and validly as possible. And so we went about adapting the assessment to select those skills, and in the end we were able to assess 2 of the 3 ELA foundations. One of the foundations that we could not assess was the writing domain, and the primary reason for that was that it doesn't exist in the Getting on Track assessment. And then the other was 4 out of the 5 math foundations. There we were unable to assess analysis. That was one of the foundations we could not, again, didn't exist in the Getting on Track assessment. But the good news is that we were able to assess most of them, and we were able to adapt, take all of the resources that we had put into developing the larger Getting on Track assessment to apply to the KRI. That assessment had been developed, as I mentioned, since 2010 with a lot of input from experts both at the University of Chicago and nationally. It's been subjected to peer review. It has been tested formatively using a very rigorous IRT psychometric analysis and has been field tested with over 800 students. More relevant, or even more relevant to you is that, it doesn't say here, but we have also been having an implementation, a randomized control trial implementation, and then actual implementation with a partner in Northwest Indiana, the Geminis Head Start Corporation. And so it has been in use there for the last 3 years, both starting as a research study and now they're implementing it system-wide, and they found really great impacts on particularly the math outcomes there. And so in terms of the KRI itself, what we did here in Indiana is that once we had developed the content of the assessment, we conducted 2 field tests. The first was in spring of 2018, and we took a slightly longer version of the assessment. It was closer to 20 minutes than it was to 15 minutes to see, to collect data on actual students in Indiana to kind of re-norm the assessment. And what we found was that the statistical properties that we found in the larger Getting on Track assessment applied here in Indiana, and we adjusted slightly the psychometric properties so that they matched with Indiana. So the good news is everything that we had hoped would work in terms of having a very highly reliable and valid assessment worked when we did this in Indiana. We then had a question about whether or not assessing children in spring at the end of their, what their 4-year-old, end of their first year, the end of the 4-year to 5-year of kindergarten, of preschool, would predict kindergarten readiness. So to say another way, is the data that you collect at the end of preschool going to tell you what they know when they walk in the door in September, let's say, of the following year? Could there be summer melt? Could they learn things? Is it predictive? And so what we did is we followed 182 students into their kindergarten classrooms, and we reassessed them on the assessment at the beginning of kindergarten. And we found out that, in fact, what we learned about the children in spring predicted where they were in fall. So what that tells us is you can assess a child at the end of preschool and know where they will be in kindergarten. I can also tell you that what we ended up finding was that the kids grew slightly over spring, which was great news, that we didn't know whether they might fall back or they might not grow at all, but they grew a little bit. So they at least know what they knew when you assessed them back in spring. And then, again, we had more data, so now we had about 415 kids worth of data, and that 182. And then we decided at that point that it might make sense, because that was more of a research study than it was an actual real-life implementation, to test real-life implementation of the KRI this spring, where NORC and the University of Chicago took a step back. Our role was more just to train trainers, and then folks here on the ground implemented the assessment as it might be implemented should you adopt the assessment statewide. And so for this, we had a larger sample. We had 650 pre-K students in Marion and Vanderburgh counties. We were careful to make sure that the students came from a variety of pre-K settings, which include public school settings, faith-based, community-based pre-K settings, and home childcare. And we also had a mix of 2 different types of assessors. There's a question the foundation had about whether or not the assessment should be administered by pre-K teachers of their students or by third-party assessors. And when we did the study in 2018, we had third-party assessors do this. So it might make more sense for teachers to do it. So we wanted to see, was there a difference between having teachers versus third-party assessors? And so
A difference?
Was there a difference? So I will know the answer to that next week, but a preview is that it looks like there is not. We'll formally show that information, provide that information at a meeting next week with the foundations, but it looks like not. And in fact, it looks like the teachers might be a little bit better than the third-party assessors. That's a real concern from a scientific standpoint, right, about objectivity. I mean, could teachers be throwing the results? Could they be, oftentimes, this doesn't reflect what my child knows, I'm just going to change the assessment. For a direct assessment, that's a problem. But that wasn't a problem here. And so, last point, 2018, right, and so that's where we are.
Just to kind of reiterate what I started with, the purpose of this was to be complementary to what at the time was being developed as a broader, around 45-ish minute comprehensive assessment that included social and emotional learning, which this does not. But it was intended to provide a snapshot that can be aggregated at the pre-K classroom, provider, local, regional, and state level to inform policymakers, educators, and the public about the academic readiness of Indiana's pre-K children. And it will help us identify, for example, let's say kids knock it out of the park on oral language and literacy, but they're struggling in numeracy. That can help the incoming kindergarten classroom say, we better really focus on that. And it can also help the pre-K setting say, we better think about doing something different with what we're doing in the pre-K setting. So that is the purpose of it. As Mark said, they are actually wrapping up the expanded pilot that he just talked about, and we're supposed to get a report with the actual statistical data and the feedback from the teacher, the different kind of administrators next week. And we can share that information with you if you would like, but we wanted to let you know about this project that's been ongoing in earnest since 2017. We've had wonderful partners from Early Learning Indiana here in Marion County and 4C in Evansville, Dr. David Smith, superintendent in Evansville Vandenberg School Corporation, and then Dr. Farabee, the former superintendent of IPS. So thank you for your time.
Claire and Mark, thank you for this exciting work. I really appreciate the depth of research that was done with this. I tend to raise validity, reliability questions all the time on the board, and I feel confident without even looking at your work that this is something that is well-designed, well-researched, and have a significant impact on students. My question deals with the longitudinal nature of this. So obviously there's predictive validity going into kindergarten, but is there, you know what's coming, is there any attempt to look at first grade, maybe second grade, third grade, in particular those students who went through this process and those that didn't? Reason why I'm asking, the research from Head Start has shown us that students who go through a Head Start and those who don't, when they get to about second or third grade, all of a sudden they come together, and you've seen that research. And so the question is raised about whether Head Start's really worth it, the amount of money we spend in America on that. And so I guess I'm hoping you will say maybe that's a second or third study that we can look at whether or not there's predictive validity, not only for kindergarten, which there is, but also maybe second and third grade.
Questions. I could talk to you forever about this, and I know I don't have the time. So what I would say is that we don't have that data yet, and it's something that we're very interested in. So there are multiple kind of tacks that we could take to trying to learn that. One is through, again, the larger Getting on Track assessment. It is a bigger set of skills that we're assessing. There's more time to assess, and so we are actively talking with some national foundations to add on to the work that we've been doing for the last 9 years to do those longitudinal assessments in that context. They're harder to do, and one of the exciting things when you don't have kind of like a statewide kind of effort, right? Like what's exciting about this opportunity is if you were to move forward with this, you have the data, you would have the data that you could connect to the data, the data that you're already collecting on kids going forward. So the answer is we don't have that on this tool yet, but we'd love to have it. We really want to look at that. We're working with foundations to do that. With the bigger Getting on Track and whether there's any interest in following some of these kids forward, either at the state level or the foundation level, that's also something that could be done. The question about the fade out and what happens, I mean, it's a longer conversation, but it is, yeah, you're on board, yeah.
Second and final question, so I don't dominate the conversation, is regarding the data that you will need to run it if we do approve it. I assume that data is already embedded in Department of Education systems, and some of it will be your own data that you will collect. Is that where data is going to emanate from, or how will it all come about, and what role do we play as a board or Department of Ed in this to forward?
I would defer to your staff at the State Board of Ed and the staff of the department to answer that question. As I mentioned at the outset, it was really, it's a focus area of our two foundations in our respective counties to make sure that kids are successful in kindergarten. And so we put grant funding into this work because we wanted to help develop a short assessment that would give an accurate read for pre-K providers and for the incoming districts and kindergarten classrooms about what is going on with our children, so that we can make better allocation decisions with our public and private resources. As I mentioned, we negotiated a royalty-free license. So this could be gifted for free to the state of Indiana or to a nonprofit, for example, Early Learning Indiana. And then we mentioned that it was mobile enabled, so all the data exists on the cloud, which makes it easy to analyze and store.
Yeah, so now in the NRC University of Chicago data systems, but the next step would be whatever entity would want to take over this, we would negotiate transfer that data into their systems. And there would have to be some work in terms of making sure that can happen, but we're setting it up to do that, yeah.
That's what I was getting at, the legacy of it. Obviously, if we start this, I assume it's going to be successful. We'd have to build in legacy, who's going to take it on and continue it. Thank you for being here.
Can we dig just a little deeper there? You know, Claire, you know this for sure, that I always like to do the king or queen for a day thing. If we could to go further with where Dr. Freitas was going, what all would you, if you could create the plan today and be king and queen on this, what would happen? I'd just like to know that from your perspective.
Yeah, I always like to start slow before going fast. So the first thing is that right now we don't know if our children are ready for kindergarten. We don't have that information. It's been very helpful partnering with Early Learning Indiana and with 4C because they can tell us boots on the ground what's happening in the pilots, and what we've heard anecdotally is it's been extraordinarily helpful in identifying strengths and weaknesses within their programs and areas where they need to double down and make some changes. So our first hope is that this can be adopted by other providers, and again, we've intentionally tested it with all types of providers since that's the mixed delivery system we have in Indiana. We wanted it to be affordable and easy to use so that there would be helpful information to inform all the stakeholders that care about the success of children in Indiana, and complementary to other efforts to do impartial and testing of social emotional learning and other dimensions that are also important, but don't lend themselves well to direct observation.
I love the public-private partnership, and I love the fact that it's short. I'm big on that with assessments, right?
That's the feedback we've heard from the pre-K staff, is short is good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank
for your
you.
work. Moving on to new business. Daleville Community Schools, Indiana Virtual Schools, Indiana Virtual Pathways Academy. Public comment on this one? Mary Ann, we are ready for you, and you are ready. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nothing's changed. Thank you for giving me the time to comment now. I am Mary Ann Schlegel-Ruger. I am a parent, and I'm also a lawyer, and much of my work has been with corporate transactions, public offerings, a lot of work with investors over the years, and now more recently, I've done a lot of work with for-profit higher education, as well as a lot of work with charter schools and public schools, and focusing a lot back on my past working with investors of what would an investor need to know whether they wanted to invest in a company, because we are looking at this much like a company now. And I find that what an investor would want to have is exactly what parents and you and charter authorizers often don't have. And so I have a few suggestions, and I'm speaking at this point because I think we have an example right now of where we haven't had enough information. And perhaps you've been as starved for information as everyone else has. So I have a few suggestions, and I also want to make the aside, I do want to assure you that employees have been trying and begging for someone to listen to them for years about Indiana Virtual School. And they went to the appropriate places, and those places didn't have the authority to help them. And some of those employees were fired for doing that. So we've had whistleblowers for years, and now it's come to this, and now we're out all of this money. In light of that, some things that I've discovered, even after working with for years, I didn't realize. I didn't realize until just the last few years that our new charter schools are not audited, are not required to have an audit until not at the end of their first year of operation, June 30th of whatever the year is, even though they may have already been recruiting students, they may already have leased a building, built a building. I mean, they are an entity that's already running and is accruing debts and expenses that then they will pay out of state funds as soon as they get them. But instead, I've discovered recently that the rule is it's not until the end of the first year in which they actually receive their tuition funds. So for instance, the Indiana Agriculture and Technology School, when I went onto the SBO website to think, okay, their financials are there now, I think I want to look at these, I discovered that they're not there yet, even though they finished a complete year with their children. And parents have entrusted those children to their care and their education and have trusted that what they say will happen when they're enrolled will be, and that they'll be financially stable, on and on. And I've discovered that actually they won't be audited until late this year. There's no public information available on their finances unless someone knows that they could do a public records request. And I will tell you, I did do a public records request, and I waited almost a year for the results, which I finally got a few weeks ago. And I discovered that their founders have been receiving 15% interest on loans to the company. We don't do that. Had they been audited in a timely fashion, they would have known they shouldn't have done that, and that would have stopped very quickly. So my suggestion is, and I don't know if you have the capacity or if this is the legislature that should be pursued this year, that audit needs to be moved up. These are new companies. They're very entrepreneurial. They need help, and they need the benefit of that audit instead of finding out 2 years later maybe that they really should have been writing receipts for the cash that they receive. They should have been writing invoices for disbursements. They should file tax returns with the IRS so that they don't lose their 501c3 status. And all of those have happened, sometimes frequently. Sometimes you read about them in northwestern Indiana where they're covered more. So I would suggest that, and the other key thing that I think that we see in this example that must be considered is, as you know, right now, charter schools are all audited by independent CPA firms who are experienced in auditing other industries, and they can choose, as a private company can. But many of those aren't very experienced with auditing schools. I would strongly suggest for at least the first 2 years of existence that be taken over by the State Board of Accounts, who is so experienced at this, and they can not only find problems that might be dangerous, but they can help them. I would encourage that for all charter schools, but at a minimum for the virtual and the blended schools, because that's where we have the problem of a child is not at the school where they can be physically counted. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to discuss this more if you'd like. Did you have any questions?
Any questions?
Well, I do want to thank you for coming, because
Thank
the
you.
one thing that's been in my mind during this whole situation with Daleville is, how did no one know about this? You're saying there were teachers that knew what was going on and parents that knew what was going on, but they weren't able to get assistance.
Because I didn't represent the school, and I'm not involved with Daleville, and I'm not commenting on Daleville's role here. I don't know how much people knew. I will tell you that I had a client contact me 2 years ago who had gone to what should be appropriate channels for a school problem, and they couldn't help, although they tried, and then was fired within days for trying. And they were right on the money with their comments.
Daleville teachers?
No, these would be IVS.
Okay.
No, I don't have any experience or information with Daleville, and I definitely don't want to comment on Daleville today. I'm definitely not qualified to do that. But definitely there were huge red flags, and when a charter school neglects to have their audit done for multiple years, that in itself is a red flag. As an investor, I would never invest in a company like that. I would run so fast. And yet, somehow in trying to be entrepreneurial and innovative and do new things, which are good things, we have somehow left thousands of students adrift. And apparently thousands more out there somewhere, but we don't know where. It's a huge failure of our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. Before I begin, I just wanted to offer the board a roadmap of the presentation for today, so we are all on the same page as far as who's going to be discussing what. I'll be providing a brief summary of the proposed determination that's been provided to the board members. The State Examiner, Paul Joyce, is here to provide a summary of the affidavit that the State Board of Accounts provided under his name. The organizer, to the best of my knowledge, has chosen not to attend this meeting today and will not be addressing the board. However, there are representatives from the authorizer, Daleville, available for any questions that the board may have, but they do not have a presentation for the board at this time. So with that, we can go ahead and dive in. As the board members are aware, a proposed determination was issued to the authorizer, Daleville Community Schools, as well as the organizers for Indiana Virtual School and Indiana Virtual Pathways Academy. This proposed determination contained 3 recommendations. First, that the school's ADM accounts be adjusted over the last 3 years in line with the findings from the State Board of Accounts. That recommendation that the department and the Board of Accounts pursue the recovery of funds from the schools based off of the incorrect ADM counts. And finally, a recommendation that the Department of Education, to the extent possible, engage in enhanced student monitoring of students at these schools to ensure the ADM counts are accurate and the students are participating. The board's authority to adjust the school's ADM count is found in Indiana Code 20-43-4-2. The language in that statute says that if the board makes a determination that a school's ADM count is not accurate, it has the authority to adjust that ADM count, which of course is what we're asking for here today. The State Board of Accounts has directed an audit for the 16-17, 17-18, and 18-19 school years. The authority for that is found in Indiana Code 5-11-1-9. Additionally, in this situation, we have materials from the authorizer, Daleville, regarding an independent analysis that the authorizer conducted of the charter schools, which resulted in a revocation recommendation to both schools that was issued earlier this year. So with that summary, a little more detail in these recommendations. As I said, the first recommendation is to adjust the ADM count for both schools. This is based off of both the findings from State Board of Accounts as well as the authorizer's findings. As noted in the proposed determination, the State Board of Accounts, the audit concluded that the ADM information was inaccurate for both schools by at least 50% for all 3 years. That is the number that is being recommended to reduce the ADM for both schools for all 3 years. Additionally, based off of the authorizer's review, it was determined that a majority of full-year students at both schools were failing to either participate at all in any coursework and or receive any credits at all during the course of a school year. These findings combined support the recommendation to adjust the ADM count as outlined in the proposed determination. That brings me to recommendation number 2, which deals with fund recovery of tuition support that's been issued to these schools over the last 3 years. This is actually, there's 2 parts of this. One is the adjustment of tuition support to the schools going forward. This is simply a recommendation to the department, which has ultimate authority on determining what kind of schedule this tuition support will be subject to. The recommendation is that given where we're at in the current school year, a suspension of future payments is the only way to begin to recover or to recover the funds based off of the inaccurate ADM information. It's also recommended that the department pursue under its legal authority the appointment of a prosecutor to pursue additional recovery of funds from the parties that receive those funds inaccurately. Third, it is recommended that the State Board of Accounts, who also has authority to pursue public funds, engage in that fund recovery process in line with this proposed determination. That brings me to the third recommendation, which is the enhanced student monitoring. I think that more or less speaks for itself, and that obviously based off of the self-reported data from these schools that these students are not participating, that to the extent the department is able to, engage in any additional student monitoring that's possible. As noted in the closure agreements for both schools, there are a number of monitoring policies that the authorizer and the schools have agreed to that might provide some guidance to the department as far as what kind of data could be available upon request. In addition, both the authorizer and the charter schools have provided objections, written objections, to the proposed determination. The authorizer's objection focuses primarily on the fund recovery issue, which is ultimately the responsibility of the Department of Education, so I don't think it's necessary to address that objection before the board. The organizer's objections fail to provide any substantive argument regarding the Board of Accounts determinations and claims set forth in the affidavit. So again, I don't think there's anything worth addressing at this time as far as the objection is concerned. So with that, I'm prepared to turn this over to State Examiner Paul Joyce, unless there's any questions.
I have one question, and I'm a simple guy. How did we miss this?
We.
How was this missed?
You
And
know,
by whom
that's-
was this missed? I'll ask you two questions.
That's a difficult question to answer. It's a very good question. I think you have to look at what the board's authority is under Title 20 as far as authorizers and charter schools. The board's authority is relatively limited. The way that the legislature has set up the code is that authorizers are usually the primarily responsible party for ensuring that they have a robust charter agreement and that they are monitoring the charter schools that they authorize. So I wouldn't phrase it as how did we miss this, because it's really simply not something that we necessarily have authority to monitor.
2016 or 2017, Exhibit 2, 740 students, no assigned courses for semester 1. 1,048 students, no assigned courses for semester 2. Who did that data go to?
That data was my understanding is that data was self-reported by the charter schools to the authorizer, Daleville.
And nobody went,
I'm sorry?
what?
Oh,
At that point?
I'm sorry, is that not accurate? Okay, I'm sorry. That data was reported to the Department of Education. But it was the data that is referenced.
When was that reported? Would it have been in 16 and 7, at the end of 17?
I'd like to answer the question. I would like to point out the data, as far as it's referenced in this document, was derived from Daleville's revocation recommendation that was issued to the organizer.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Paul Garrison. I'm the superintendent at Daleville Schools. I've been there at the school for 43 years. I've been the superintendent 23. This isn't one of my proudest moments. I'll let you know that. But to answer your question, which is a very good question, I want no focus of blame here on DOE. What happened foundationally is a lack of, this board tried to provide some guardrails last year regarding virtual education, particularly to charters. We made a list of recommendations to this board at that time. And it was, if you go back and look at that document, it was a very robust list of recommendations. But the number that you brought up was a compilation of data from different IDOE reports. So Daleville Community Schools, as authorizer, was given access to the IDOE reports for the schools we authorize effective August the 1st last year.
And when would those reports have been submitted to DOE?
They would have been submitted to IDOE in those calendar years. But the data that was just presented to you derives from many of those IDOE reports with, with an investigative look. So just to give you an idea of the exhaustive amount of work it took to get to that point, we have a spreadsheet with 250 cells, 250,000 cells of information, 14,000 lines on about 50 to 60 data points. And by analyzing all of those state reports and different things that schools report, because of our knowledge of what we report and how we report it for our schools, we were able to pull that data in a manner that could be analyzed. It all goes to the state as a comma delimited file, each and every report we send. And those are self-reported by school administrators, including school administrators for the charter schools. And so as of August the 1st, we had access to that data as authorizers, and we had asked for that. And legislation was passed giving us that authority. And that legislation went into effect July 1 last year. We were given access August 1st, shortly after one of your meetings, actually, or a meeting of the committee, I think. And at that point, we started pulling down data. But as you can imagine, the time involved in that kind of data pull, the reports weren't really designed. They were designed for various things. There's a course completion report on every student in every school, every semester, supposedly. And that includes course assignments. There's daily attendance reports. There's ADM reports. I'm not the person in our school corporation who does all of that reporting, so I can't identify every one of them. But what I can tell you is it's a lot of data to get a hold of, to sift through in a manner with a focus on particular issues to arrive at that analysis and that statement. IDOE never received a report at any time, to my knowledge, that 740 students, did not, until our analysis came forward and we put that out as part of our objection.
Superintendent Garrison, I just have a question since you're there. Over the 3 years in question that we're looking at now, did Delville provide any monitoring or oversight to these schools at all?
Yes.
I'm going back to his question he posed earlier. How could this be missed if the authorizer is doing authorizing job they're supposed to be doing?
Before that legislation was passed, our only access to data was according to a contract, because all charters are contracts. And so that's part of the guidance, I believe, that needs to be part of the chartering process, is here's what a charter ought to look like. These are the things that you ought to have in it to be able to monitor different items. But there was no one giving that advice.
In the charter agreement.
So it's in the agreement, but what I'm telling you is there needs to be guidance on what that agreement needs to look like and what needs to be in it. And that guidance isn't out there other than borrowing from other authorizers. And that's what we did. But once that agreement's in place, you have to live by the agreement. And so the data we have was only data we could ask for and be supplied. Just as the DOE received data, it came from them, and it wasn't the data that we saw.
You never submitted data, right, Paul? That all came from IVS to DOE.
Right.
Didn't come through Daleville Schools, and Daleville Schools reported it to the department.
Now, this is self-reported data
Self-reported.
by the charter schools that we offer. We just gained access to it directly with IDOE's cooperation from their database. Once we had access to the data, we could go backwards into the reporting, what that data actually meant. I mean, if you look at it, got rows for every student in a school, numbers separated by commas. Given to IDOE by STN numbers. So we had a chance to look at all that ourselves. One of the reasons that we asked the legislature
Mr. Superintendent, you had a contract with this charter school, is that correct?
Right.
Are you signatory to that contract?
I am.
So during the process, before you signed it, I'm sure you went through a process to figure out what you would need, what data you would need, what systems would you need, what accountability would you need to build into that contract before you actually signed it. Is that correct?
Yeah, and if you look at the contracts and the proposals, you'll see.
So you had the opportunity to put in all kinds of accountability systems and data flowing directly to you and someone in your office would actually view it. That could have been part of the contract. Is that correct?
That could have been part of the contract, but we would have not had direct access to that data.
You
It would
could
have to
if
be
you put it into the
reported, it would have to be
contract.
reported data.
You could have done that in formulating that contract and not sign off on the contract till you were comfortable that you had the accountability measures to ensure that this would not happen.
Right, but I'll go back to what I said earlier. That guidance exists. It was totally, and it should exist.
Well, whether there was guidance or not, you're the superintendent, you're responsible for this charter school. You could have built that in. Tim, I have some questions for you, and I'll
If
be.
we could, is your question for them? Can we let
Okay.
Pete ask, and then we'll call Tim up now, is that okay?
So it looks like a couple years ago, there was a second charter created, the Pathways. So can you explain the reasoning, or how was that second school to be differentiated? Was it serving a different type of student? What was the thought when that second school was created?
I would direct you back to the proposal. So the proposal for that particular charter, if you go back into the documents that are at least supplied on our website, and I think you have access to, I mean, I know they're publicly accessed. If you go back to the proposal for IVPA, that school, you'll see that there's a whole robust set of student outreach initiatives, particularly around engagement and following student engagement and adding services that wasn't in the original. And at that time, most of those things were things we were asking the organizer.
Why was that necessary to create another entity? Why couldn't those services have been provided to the original school?
They could have been provided in the original school. Agreement for that school did not require those to be provided.
Other questions?
Tim, how much money are we talking about? I know Mr. Joyce is here to report, but just quickly, how much money are we talking about roughly?
Roughly in basic tuition support, we're talking about a total of about $80 million over the 3 years. That does not account for additional funds such as funds associated with special education and whatnot. But that's the basic
So
tuition support.
$80 million somewhere around there.
Yes.
How did Daleville become an authorizer?
So that's actually an interesting question. The original statutory mechanism for the pilot program for virtual education, which I want to say originated about 8 or 9 years ago at this point. Basically created a pilot program that allowed Daleville to become an authorizer and authorized charter school, Indiana virtual school. Though that law has since been changed and school corporations are no longer permitted to be authorizers for virtual charter schools.
I heard you say that the board does not have primary responsibility, this board, for overseeing this charter school. Did I hear you correctly? And that it's the authorizer who has a responsibility for doing that, and they get paid money for doing that, is that correct? So they're not doing it as a public service. They are getting financial remuneration for that.
Authorizers are entitled to an administrative fee of 3% of the tuition support received by the charter schools.
So 3% of how much?
Well, at least 80 million.
80 million plus?
Please don't ask me to do math.
Okay.
But do you know how much was actually received over this 3-year period in authorizer fees?
I'm sorry?
You know how much was received in authorizer fees over the 3 years?
I would defer to representatives from Daleville for that figure.
I did not bring the data with me to answer that question.
Is it 600 million?
It is also
80
on
million?
it is also on our website, the exact dollars from each. I'm trying to add up my head. 2.4 million is probably close.
So Tim, what's the process that this state board uses to decertify an authorizer? What process do we follow to do that?
So the process that I'm familiar with, and I don't know if it'd be considered decertifying, but it's actually tied to accountability. When you have an authorizer that has a charter school that is not meeting state minimum requirements, which is tied to accountability, then if that authorizer were to continue to charter that school and basically ignore because they would have to seek board permission at a certain point to continue to charter, and if they were to ignore that determination by the board, then the board has the authority to, as you say, decertify. That's the only process I can think of off the top of my head. It might be the only process to decertify that I'm familiar with.
So that's for the authorizer, not the charter school, right?
Correct.
So we have the authority to decertify, and I'm not sure the exact terminology, but do away with that authorizer's responsibility. And you're saying there is a process for that, does not require a law, and that's part of our ability to do that.
Yes, but again, I believe that process is tied to accountability and not necessarily a situation such as this, where we're dealing with additional issues as far as auditing and financial concerns.
I think we've discovered a hole in our regulations or in state law that we're going to have to ask the legislature to. Thanks.
Other questions?
So do the proposed remedies here include any type of clawback of any of the authorizer fees?
So the proposed determination in recommendation number 2, which is dealing with the funding issue, it does reference the fact that fees were, the administrative fee was issued to the authorizer in addition to the tuition support going to the charter schools, and that to the extent possible, the parties with authority to do so should attempt to recover those funds. I should say that that is the specific issue that that Daleville has raised an objection to and has raised legal concerns on the authority to do that. But that's something that the Department of Education would have to determine what the appropriate steps are, given that it's their authority to recover those funds, not the board's. Okay, so before I turn it over, just in summary, The recommendation is three-part. One, adjust ADM by reducing it by 50% for all 3 years. Two, recommendation for the appropriate parties to pursue the recovery of funds. And three, to the extent possible, recommend that the department pursue enhanced student monitoring activities. And with that, I will invite Representative. Oh, okay.
Covered it all. Are there any questions by board members?
I have a question for Mr. Joyce. Thanks for being here today. Appreciate it. I know how busy you are. Does this get into the realm of potentially criminal activity at all?
I would say,
And has the FBI been contacted or state law enforcement?
that I can't say, but I can say that in situations like this, we do contact all of our law enforcement partners to work with them.
Thank you. I'm glad that you are seeing it as serious as we
I will say, things did come up that, just to add that in August of 2018 is when Delville Schools did come to our office to bring their concerns, on top of some other concerns that we already had due to the delinquency of the 2016 audit and the difficulty that that auditor was having getting the records from these two individual schools. And when they did come, they did discuss about how they had now received that data from the Department of Education and had the spreadsheets that they did discuss with them to bring this to us so we could move forward then with investigations that we needed to do.
So is it your intent to turn it over to a prosecutor if you haven't already?
When we identify anything that would be fraudulent in nature, we will turn it over to the Attorney General for civil collection and involve local prosecutors or federal prosecutors for anything that was criminal.
Any other questions?
Were these discrepancies just obvious from the audits that you were provided, or did you have to do a deep data dive to uncover this?
The discrepancies themselves won't be specifically within the audit being a financial, because that's going to show numbers. And the numbers are going to show the revenues, the numbers are going to show associated expenses. Those themselves, we can't really get into because there may be something else that went on from those financial statements that were presented. Would the numbers themselves from saying we went to ADM count this in 2012, 2013, 2014, 15, 16, show an obvious increase? Yes. I mean, that was, it went skyrocket to this last year where there were so many that was there. And then, of course, as specified within the affidavit, when you go back and look at those, they were students that were added from prior year that had been dropped off, or in one instance, a deceased student. Those kind are obvious from a post standpoint. It's always easy to look behind, in which what we're doing now is looking behind. During the course of that, I think that it would be much harder to review and much harder to see. That's not saying that oversight isn't what allowed it to occur. Oversight is always what allows anything to occur over a period of time that's identified later on. It's usually is a lack of oversight. But it's usually not a lack of oversight by one individual person or entity. It's usually a group, and can even always go back to the part of the enabling legislations that might be doing it, the agreements that are written. There's a lot of great charter schools out there. There's a lot of great agreements out there. Some have very strong controls over the entities that are underneath them. I'm not aware of any boilerplate either that says, okay, this is what we have to have within those agreements. That being said, it still did skyrocket, and there is something that says, hey, what's going on here?
Any other questions? Seeing none, is there a motion? motion to approve staff recommendation. Is there a second? Second. Roll call, please.
Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
Yes.
Yes. Moving on to choice scholarship waivers. Okay. Heather, you're up. Okay, absolutely. Okay.
So the proposed determination in front of the board is a request for a waiver of consequences for a choice scholarship school, specifically Holy Angels Catholic School. This waiver request was submitted pursuant to Indiana Code 20-51-4-9. A little bit of background about what these waivers, why we have these waivers presented to the board. Pursuant to Indiana Code, choice scholarship schools that receive a combination of Ds or Fs over consecutive years will have their ability to accept new choice scholarship students suspended until their accountability metrics improve. The consequences vary depending on the actual combination of grades and the number of years that the school receives those. In this situation, we have a school that has received, before this most recent year, received 3 consecutive Ds. Therefore, under the Indiana Code, they are required to receive a C or better for 2 consecutive years. In this case, the school went from a D to a C in the most recent school year, which was the improvement in the grade was based mostly on improvement in student growth. So therefore, because the school has demonstrated that academic improvement of improving nearly 7 accountability points to a C, it is recommended that the waiver request be granted and that the school have a waiver of consequences and be able to accept new choice scholarship students.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Heather Willey. I'm a partner at Barnes & Thornburg, and I appreciate the opportunity just to comment on this request. I'm joined today by Ryan Clark, who's with the University of Notre Dame and the Alliance for Catholic Education, and in the audience, Gina Fleming, who is the Superintendent of Schools for Mother Theodore Catholic Academies, which includes Holy Angels. And I just wanted to share with the board, one, to thank you for the support that we had last year in granting a request for a waiver. 3 years ago, the Catholic schools under Mother Theodore Academies came to the University of Notre Dame, who is my client, and they formed a partnership called with the Alliance for Catholic Education, ACE, which is Notre Dame's program to really invigorate Catholic schools and to ensure academic success in those schools. And as a result of the partnership, we've been working with all 5 schools under this umbrella. One, which is Central Catholic, has been pulled out of consequences. They were in consequences 2 years ago. We also have seen significant improvement in Holy Angels when we took over, or when we came in as a partner they were receiving a grade of F, and so we've seen significant academic improvement. I know Dr. McCormick and others supported our request last year, and we really appreciate it. I think it was Dr. McCormick who said, don't come back unless you've seen significant growth again, and so here we are. And we take accountability very seriously. We have another school, unfortunately, that we have not seen the same success, that did receive a waiver last year, and we are not bringing that to the board because we feel like there's significant work to be done there. And we're creating a lot of interventions, including intensive professional development, change in school leadership, new curriculum, as well as many other strategies to ensure success in that school as well. So we appreciate this continued opportunity to enroll these students. We feel like we're making significant academic improvement. Appreciate the favorable recommendation by staff, and we'd appreciate your favorable support as well. Thank you.
We have a motion and a second. Any questions by board members? Roll call, please.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
Yes. Thank you. On the new business C, election of a secretary.
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Tony Walker as our secretary.
Second.
Any other nominations? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Approve.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
Yes.
Hard abstention.
Yes. Now, we have resolutions honoring Carrie Wicker, Dr. Mary Ann McCann, Dr. Steve Yeager, and Gordon Hendry for their service on this board. I'm not going to read these in, but I would open it up for comments. I had certainly had the privilege to serve with everyone that we've mentioned, and it was an honor and a privilege. So I thank them for their service. I would open it up to any other board members that would like to make a statement. We will, obviously, I will sign these and we will get them mailed out to them. I'm not going to read all four of them individually. So any comments by board members? Seeing none, thank you. We're on to discussion. Do we want to break or do we want to push through?
Keep going.
I got one break and one keep going. Okay, split the difference and do 5 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break. We will reconvene. We'll do 7 minutes at 10:35. Bro. Yeah, I didn't do that. Brian, is it a single motion to approve all resolutions?
The cultures never change.
I didn't even vote on, we didn't even vote on the resolution.
Oh, we kind of need to do that.
Yeah.
You need
missed
somebody
that
to
one.
move.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you do that as soon as we sit down? Single motion.
All the way down to the young kids.
Mr. Chair, I think we need to go back and officialize, it's probably not a word, you'll get red dots underneath that, but I like making up words. So officialize those congratulatory resolutions and that recognize the service of Carrie, Marianne, Gordon, and Steve. So I move that we approve those resolutions.
A motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Thank you for catching me on that. Now we have action item E, formative grants.
Good morning. This morning, I wanted to request approval for the formative grant distributions alongside the designated list of formative assessment providers for 1920. In relationship to formalizing both of those documents, I wanted to briefly describe the process that was undertaken in order to present all of that information to the board. As you're aware, annually, the formative provider list is given to schools by the department following your approval. And each year, we are most thoughtful about the criteria that can be used to establish that list. Since my time at the department, we moved from a process where very limited criteria had been used to establish that list. And at one time, I believe that list was over 30 different providers. Since my time at the department, what we've tried to do, as you're well aware, as considering both iLearn and iStep and ultimately the interim and formative providers, is really try to ensure that for the state of Indiana, we have developed a system of assessments, meaning that they're coherent, they follow a theory of action, and I believe our theory of action has strongly been based on alignment of those assessments to career and college readiness standards, and ultimately making sure that we're most efficient in the types of assessments that can be offered to students to gather that relevant data. So as a result this year, in trying to think about the national perspective of how we better develop a system of assessments for the state of Indiana, we utilized a research-based protocol established by Ellen Fort in her work with several states through a federal enhanced assessment grant. So through that protocol, there's 4 different criteria that are utilized to review assessment programs to determine that they meet a quality standard for implementation locally. Those 4 criteria, and the rubric was provided on our website in advance, well in advance to providers to ensure that they could meet that criteria, was based on having assessment programs that assessed English language arts and mathematics, having alignment to Indiana standards, and with the alignment to Indiana standards, we did allow some flexibility. We realized that vendors often serve multiple states, and so having 100% alignment to Indiana standards may not always be reasonable, but we did set that threshold at 85%. That had to be validated by a third-party entity. In other words, a provider could not submit a report that they had conducted internally to verify that they had met an 85% alignment threshold. We also expected that 90% of the assessment was also aligned to Indiana content standards, specifically to those test forms. We also considered their test development practices, their scoring practices, the types of reports that would ultimately be provided both to educators and parents. And for the first time this year, I was very excited to leverage multiple perspectives at the table with our staff when these decisions were made. So again, historically, there have been different processes and engagements over time. This year, we actually had 10 corporation level staff that are typically very engaged in assessment selection processes locally at the table with us to formalize these recommendations for you. So as a result of all of that effort, I wanted to bring forward our recommendations today.
Dr. Flores, is this a time-sensitive decision?
It is timely in that many of the schools and corporations will need those funds to initiate assessment for this upcoming school year. So there are some that are likely engaging in some sort of contractual agreements or at least negotiating those as we speak, knowing that the school year is imminently upon us.
Is the review process closed, or is that something we could have ongoing? I'll get on the list at a later.
Our formal process is closed. We did have an end date for those submissions by April 19th to determine who could be on the provider list for 1920. Again, the rationale for that is we do have to wait until the legislative cycle has concluded to determine what funds would be available, or if in fact funds would be available at all in respect to the formative grant. And so we wanted to ensure that that alignment of the date obviously coincided with when decisions of that sort would be made, but then also provide an appropriate ramp for schools and corporations to procure those materials and establish needed professional development to deploy those well. I think it is a bit challenging to have an ongoing submission process just because you could really not have the best laid plans if you're not really thoughtful about the types of products and the implementation of those most appropriately.
Current vendor, they just have.
So the grant funds are allocated for a specific provider, yes.
Would it be possible, I know that this is a conversion, would it be possible for us, I know it's not ideal, but to extend that window? The only reason that I say that is I know that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that the actual list of vendors went live the day the grant was due.
I'm not sure I understand that exactly. So we had.
When schools go on to look at what vendors they can use, it said coming soon, whatever that was, that list wasn't posted until the day the grant was due. So I'm certain we've had schools that applied for this grant, assuming that their vendor that they used the prior year would still be eligible. So I'd hate for those schools to lose out on that money. That is why I would ask that if there are vendors that would like to submit still, what does that process take? Is it something that can be done in 30 days?
So one of the key criteria related to the process for evaluation is in regards to alignment. Alignment studies are a significant undertaking. In my experience, to have a quality third-party study can take several months in order to submit and have that thoroughly developed and ultimately approved. If we were to allow for additional submissions, I'm just to be honest, not sure of what a reasonable date to conclude that effort would be. We have previously had more flexibility with the timeline. In my experience and in the conversations with the committee, part of the challenge of this work right now was that several vendors were deficient in light of that criteria, and I'm not sure what a clear path forward would be for them to resolve those.
So Charity, given what you said, and I'm not questioning the process, because I like the process, but given when this came about, I might not have, as a company, had the opportunity, because if that takes several months, I wouldn't have been able to get that done to their point, right? And that's, and I think, and I'm asking from the standpoint that I have had schools contact me on this because they're, as you know also, I mean, it goes beyond the test. My professional learning community operates around what those formative assessments are. If I change that, I can't change that in June in a lot of cases, right? For that to work, which is when all of this came about. So that's, I think where some of this concern comes from is what we've heard from some schools about how do you make this change right now to pick one? So do I just go with what I've done, take the hit if I'm able to? I mean, some schools would be able to, some schools wouldn't be able to. And then that becomes, and then I start to question, okay, what's best for kids at this point, right? And that's my challenge, or where I have trouble reconciling with that. Because if it's several months, companies legitimately would not have been able to have gotten that done in some cases.
So we did post the criteria in December and had notified the vendors that were previously approved of that criteria. There are some that continued to be approved over the course of time. One of the things that I will note is through the conversations with educators, they truly held those criteria in high regard. So some aspects where we had previously potentially allowed more flexibility, the educators truly felt that those were cornerstones for this type of process and did not want to dismiss that criteria as being upheld. And so I honestly believe that by having those educators involved, the vendors that are on the list now were held to a higher regard. And in terms of kind of revisiting the timeline, ultimately the board has the flexibility of approving those vendors. The caveat that I would state is I do think it is still very important that we have an established timeline where that is clearly delineated and maintained. Otherwise, just in terms of resources in these educator committees, I think it tends to become very circular if a vendor truly doesn't have a quality product to ever really meet that criteria.
Do we know how many schools, districts wouldn't, the list went from like 40-ish to 6, correct? Last year's list was 40-ish or 6 now. Do we have any idea how many schools will not be eligible to get this money?
I don't have that readily available. I have a staff member kind of monitoring. We don't have that information today.
We had 10 educators, current educators in school districts, working in school districts. Did all 10 of their vendor get selected?
I'm not sure.
Because this is a personal issue, because mine didn't get selected. And we're being touted nationally about using this vendor and our kid owning our data and how our teachers make educational decisions for those kids off of this data. They provided a correlation study that showed where their items correlate to the state standards. No, it was not an alignment study. My question is, when that was identified, did anybody reach out to them and say, hey, you didn't give us an alignment, it was a correlation, because they paid thousands of dollars to a third-party vendor who then didn't complete the work that they needed, were they given an opportunity to correct that? Because in previous years, they were.
So I did receive confirmation that some of the panel members actually recommended that their current products not be used going forward. So some of them actually transitioned. In regards to the follow-up for those areas, based on that rubric that we had publicly posted, and I believe all of you received access to it as well, the vendors where they were deficient actually received the committee feedback for those areas that were flagged as not meeting that expectation or having lacking or incomplete information. Depending on when they submitted that information, they may not have had several months to reconcile that, but all of that feedback was provided to them to resolve.
Were they allowed to reconcile that? You give them the feedback. The question is, were they allowed, like in previous years, to resubmit to be approved?
They were, if they were within that time frame.
I don't understand that.
So the submission.
I mean, if you give them it on April 10th and said, hey, here's the things you're not, proficient in that you have to do more work on, but we're closing the window April 19th, you haven't given them an opportunity to get back on the list.
Right, so our committee was convened within a week or two of actually receiving those proposals for submission and then resubmitted that feedback very timely. Again, if a vendor did not submit until April 10th, it may not have been possible logistically for them to resolve that by the list deploying on June 3rd.
Okay, I guess that is my question. How reasonable is it now for us to extend that window to allow, especially it sounds like this vendor who spent money and had a third party do it, can we allow them a time frame that says, okay, we are aligned, and this is the third party that says that we're aligned? I don't know what that time frame is.
And I want to be most cautious, just from my perspective. We did assert to our vendors that the documentation that they submitted to us and any deficiencies that they had would be held confidential. So I want to be very careful about getting into specific details about a specific vendor. However, I would say that if the board has a strong recommendation about a resubmission process, the department can go back and implement an iterative process and have an additional time frame.
That would be my ask. I don't want anything vendor
Sure.
specific. I don't want anything that allows someone to,
Yes.
I want to know, does it put you in a bad place if we extend this window? Because I feel like there are probably other schools that want to keep what they have, and they may reach out to their vendors and ask them to do this. But what is that reasonable timeline? Because I don't know the answer to that.
Sure. I think from my perspective, having a clear deadline would be most appropriate, and I would welcome that feedback. I don't know how we could greatly extend it beyond like an August 1st or August 15th timeframe. I really am concerned about the school year being most imminently upon us. And so if those decisions aren't made by the school and corporation in relationship to the school year, they're potentially not receiving data that would be helpful through the course of the year.
When are the awards typically given?
The data funding to schools is dependent upon your approval. Typically, I believe it goes out to the schools within about a month or so of that approval.
I have another concern. M-Class has been approved as a assessment to utilize to identify dyslexia in students. And the department has that as a recommended product to use, but yet they're not on the approved list. So we've got data on our kids using this that we're going to use again to make certain that, we identify those kids, but that's going to be out of pocket now for those districts who use that. This is going to cost me $200,000. It's not going to be available for teacher raises because I can't access the formative assessment because we went from 46 products to 6 products. And then when I became notified about it, we spent 6 months, 4 years ago, identifying the formative assessment we wanted to use because we had teachers giving us input and we had a huge committee to get it done. So I'm kind of in this rock and hard place right now because we have all this historical data about student growth and how we make instructional decisions. And my teachers don't want to give that up because when I told them I couldn't use this product anymore, they went crazy. They said, we have to have this. This is vital to us. And yet at the same time, all of a sudden we have this change. I mean, with this huge of a change from 46 to 6, this shouldn't have been something that we got at the end of April because of the process to select somebody new. And they're all sitting out there in red. They don't want to have to go through a selection process in the month of May because that's way too late and takes way too much time, let alone all the historical data we have on formative assessment of our students that helps them learn.
So to address the 2 points separately, so in relationship to M-Class as a dyslexia screener, with the formative and interim grant, the expectation is that those dollars would be used for assessments fully aligned to Indiana academic standards. Dyslexia screeners are typically defined as something more diagnostic in nature, not specifically something that would be considered formative and interim. If that's a characteristic that we need to define further somehow, we may need to revisit that more specifically. In relationship to the timeline associated with the selection process, again, many of our challenges are specifically tied to the funding and its contingency upon the legislative session. As a result of this conversation, again, if there is a recommendation for us to amend that submission process or the requirements for us to receive additional proposals, we will do our best to accommodate that. But again, I think the establishment of a reasonable time frame to solidify that list would be most important.
I understand that the distribution of the grant money is dependent upon the legislature, but the list of products is not.
So during this legislative session, it was unclear whether this would continue to be offered.
So why did we rush it all of a sudden, take 40 people off the list then?
So as Charity mentioned, the criteria for procurement was published in December. So there was broad notice given, and we're trying to follow, because really what this is a procurement. We're trying to establish rules. It wasn't called an RFP, but essentially we're saying, here are the rules of engagement for getting on the list. In early February, all schools were notified that a new process was in place, and to be very cautious, certainly not something that was public in nature at the time, but there were questions about whether the legislature would allocate funds for this at all. So we had two reasons to suggest that to schools that, caution should be exercised because, number one, we couldn't guarantee that the list from last year would be the list for this year. It was tightened up. And we also weren't sure that the funds would be allocated at all. So we were trying to put all of those like caution signs up to the field to make sure that they couldn't presume that what had happened at the past was not a prediction for the future. So I just want to add to Charity's comments that that procurements have consequences, and I realize that we've had conversations on the phone, Dr. Mapes, just about, and obviously in your particular situation, financial ramifications for that provider not being on the list. I will say that the reasons that people aren't on the list are as varied as the number of providers, right? I mean, there were folks who didn't submit their documentation until the 26th. Said, no, there is not an extension for you, right? So I would just, for your consideration, as you're deliberating, I want to just throw out a couple of other points. One is, there was a well-published process. This used to be a decision that we made entirely internally. And instead, we said, we need practitioners, people who are in the field, who have a better understanding of the implications of picking any provider for your particular school district. And so we were very excited about that. And I think making what could be last minute changes to a process that was very thoughtful will send signals to the educators who were part of that process as well. The other thing I think, just something to throw out, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is that schools have been adjusting to what has been the new reality of the list. And so if we're now changing at this point, the window is open and there's sort of a rolling submission, there's a real chance that resubmission is not going to result in the outcome that a vendor wants. I mean, we would still have the same process, we still have the same criteria, but there's no guarantee that this year, no matter if the date is in August or September or whatever, that the results would be any different. We've had people say to us, tell me what I have to do to get approved. And we say, well, I can't, this isn't paint by number. I can't say, send me these 3 documents and I will approve you. But we can say, here is the rubric. If you can meet the rubric, we will approve you. There was no predetermined number for the department. The rubric is the threshold, right? So we're not saying, wow, we really need to narrow this list. Although I will tell you that we heard from educators that please narrow the list. So we can't boil this ocean of providers that you've given to us. So we weren't trying to limit the list, but these were the providers who ended up passing the very thoughtful process. So I just offer that for your consideration. I do think change is hard, and there are folks who are adjusting. I will say that some of the providers we've heard from who aren't on the list have come up with very creative solutions for helping schools overcome what was a corporate mistake in some cases, right? And so there's a lot of nuance here. I know you appreciate all of that. I just want to share from our perspective that there could be a lot of confusion in the field for altering what has been, I think, a very transparent process, which did not always come with the outcomes that everyone wanted.
John, was it in 2014 or 2015 when the state opened it up that you could select your vendor and the grant monies went straight to the school corporations? Because used to, the state said, here it is. We paid for it. It's available to you. If you want something else, then go ahead.
Right.
But then we started giving the grant dollars per pupil to all the school districts, and it was like, hey, you're accountable for your own kids. This is local control. You pick which vendor you want to use because we're going to hold you accountable at the end.
Right. I don't know the year. Indiana has kind of gone back and forth on this because I believe, in my recollection, and Charity can correct me if I'm wrong here, but once we left CTB product where there was sort of M-class and acuity as a pairing, that was where the state sort of paid for that contract and money didn't actually go to the schools, it just went right to the vendor. And then it did get opened up. And since that time, we've kind of had a list, and that list has shifted over time. And I think we could also argue that potentially grown to be larger than it should have been. Maybe there are things that are on there, but we won't prosecute that now. But yes, you're right that we've been
And where I'm
different
going
places.
is, okay, I can pick my own, here's your dollars. If your dollars don't match up for how much the product is you picked, that's on you. I was good with that. We were paying additional dollars. And now it's like, here's the money and here's your 6. Good luck. Well, now if I pick one of those 6, obviously I'm not going to, but the schools who do pick one of those 6, what's the emphasis from the department if they pick those 6 forward as assessments that you guys have said are the ones and they don't make it? They don't
Great
pass.
question. So an assessment is a point-in-time measurement. So just as with any assessment, the days between assessments count for much more than the days of the assessment, right? So it's a cultural implementation issue. We can't guarantee that if you pick one of the 6 providers that that your students will pass iLearn. But what we do have a lot of confidence about from the list is that the kinds of questions that your students will be asked and the measurement that will be taken on them aligns well to the assessment system we're trying to build. But the implementation is up to the local team, and we felt that the criteria that are in the list were an important way to say, hey, we have a small pot of money here to distribute at our discretion. We want to make sure that, given the big alignment question, are we aligning state dollars to come out with the best outcomes possible? We needed to do everything we could to make sure that schools were using something that had a better chance. And that doesn't mean that list is exhaustive. It's exhaustive for us right now, pending your approval for this year. But no one is precluded from resubmitting in the future. In fact, we'll open it up this fall. So we're really about, let's see, this is July. We're probably about 5 months from reopening it for the following year. So my suggestion would be to say that, I think vendors and have been served notice about what needs to happen for the future, and we should put our eggs in the basket of get ready for next year. Get on that list, and the process is not going to be any less stringent. It will involve educators again, absolutely, but I would just submit that as perhaps the best path forward. Let's focus on getting ready for next year and see what happens.
What would be the harm in extending the deadline, say, to October 1st?
I don't know. It's hard to categorize harm. I think it will be confusion. There will be confusion. So if you say, let's put it in October, I'm a little bit familiar with NWEA because I worked in Warren Township. So we gave a beginning of the year test, a mid-year test. The beginning of the year test, you want to have that done well before October, right? So let's suppose we extend it to October 1st. So October 1st, they submit. We convene a panel. Let's say aggressively we can decide in 2 weeks. Let's say best case scenario that they get approved, whoever does this. Then we're at the November board meeting to get approval, right? And then the money has to flow after that. They're not getting any money until December, in the best case scenario, with that option. And then, are people going to be switching midstream? Will they want to, we've already sort of started with one, but if we hadn't known we could wait. I mean, I'm just concerned that schools, I feel like schools need to kind of put a stake in the ground and go forward. And there are lots of schools that do spend local dollars for multiple assessments that the state does not fund. I mean, this is not the sum total of all money that's spent on formative assessments, as you all well know. So anyway, that would be my response.
But for those districts that probably will not switch their vendor, I'm sure they would much prefer to get a check, even if it's in January or February, than not get it at all for this year.
And there are a lot of things you can spend these dollars on that aren't buying this license, right? The formative assessment grant has a menu of things that you can do. So if your vendor isn't on the list, it doesn't mean you can't leverage those dollars for staff training, things like that. So this is not taking dollars away from anyone.
But would it be a hardship for the staff and the review team if the deadline was extended to October 1st?
I would say yes, but we'll do it. I mean, it's your call. It's absolutely your call. But I think it's going to be confusing for schools, and we've spent I mean, we have no objection to hard work, but we've spent a lot of cycles on getting this to where it is now, and I just question the actual value on the.
I'm ready to make a motion to approve the grant and approve the list of vendors. Let's move on.
Second. As is? Or
As is.
We're not extending the window?
Not extending the window.
We have a motion and a second.
Move to amend.
Move to amend.
What Pat's motion is with the addition of extending the window.
Accept that amendment?
I could agree that we go to August the 12th, but I agree with John on that part. That's too long of a window. If we're going to extend it, we extend it 30 days, day or Friday and be done.
August 15th, reasonable?
Yeah.
Or have it so that it's due at the next. Oh, well, that's the 25th. Sorry, I was thinking August board meeting.
Just, just another thought to go out there. I mean, so we've said no to people for different reasons, right? We've said, no, you don't meet alignment. We've said, no, you don't meet rigor. You're only testing depth of knowledge 1 and 2. We've said, no, you submitted on the 26th, not the 19th. So I just say that if there's going to be an amendment, that's going to send there are people whose product failed because it was reviewed. There are people who didn't submit timely. And this casts all of that, sort of throws all of that into like big question marks. And there have been agreements made predicated on that already with schools. There have been vendors, like I said, that have been creative, people have gotten creative on this. Vendors have said, my mistake, I'll make you whole, right? And now like, oh, well, what is it changing? Do I get to resubmit when I didn't even submit on the deadline, by the deadline? So again, that's your decision, not mine. I just want to make sure you have the full benefit of all that information.
I know that we were talking to schools all along the way. I do appreciate that.
Say that
I know that
again.
we were talking to schools throughout this process, but the actual list didn't post until the day the grant was due. The grant application was due. The list of vendors, of selected vendors, didn't post until the day the grant was due. So I think it puts schools in a bad place that they've applied for this grant. And I know we've told them not to assume, but the list was 40-some last year and it went to 6.
We extended the application for a week. So it was, for anybody who didn't get in on that day, they absolutely had a chance to apply. So the published deadline was extended for a week for schools. So there was, you're right, and I want you to know that it was also extended. So there are people who, I can't make that deadline. We had a grace period built around that, so.
As part of that process, when they indicated the request for those funds, they did not have to indicate their provider. So they were just requesting that they would have the formative grant. They did not have to commit to who it would be with.
Okay, let's go back. We have a motion and a second.
Amendment to the motion in a second.
What does your amendment
In the deadline to October 1st.
to October 1?
Not accepted as friendly, so we can need to vote.
Okay,
Separate.
roll call on the amendment. Any questions by board members?
Restate what we're exactly voting on, please.
We're voting on the amendment now, which would be to extend the deadline. The approval of the 6 is a separate motion, which will be happen. This is saying, to extend the deadline to October 1 for vendors to resubmit their applications to show alignment.
But Pat didn't accept that, right? Or Dr. Mapes didn't accept that?
No, but
He didn't accept it as friendly.
he didn't accept it as friendly. We will now vote to see if the amendment is. That's proper, correct, Tim?
to determine if the minutes can say
Clarification, so is this the amendment to extend the window for the vendors beyond the 6? So the other vendors that were on the list for last year, is that correct?
Yes. Anybody, I don't know, not just on the list. Any vendor that wants to resubmit by October 1.
I just feel we should err on the side of having more options for schools and not force them to work with 6.
And I feel like approving the 6 does give concreteness for those schools that say, I want to know who's approved for sure. But if there are others that want that option, I feel like we should grant that to them. Okay, roll call, please. This is on the amendment only, not on the motion.
Yes.
Yes. Present.
No.
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 Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Point of
now-
order.
Yes.
Could you read the names of who voted yes?
I voted yes. Six. Okay, so now we will vote to approve. The motion was to approve the 6 vendors and move forward with dispersal. Also, we have extended the window for submission to display alignment until October 1. That is this vote now.
So we're approving the grant formula with the,
Yes,
And the extension of the window.
and the extension of the window.
Can I ask a point of clarification?
Yes, absolutely.
So is it fair to assume that we would rerun the process that we run to select these vendors for anyone who would apply by October 1? Because you said alignment, the rubric covers much more than alignment. So we are going to redo the process for anybody who submits by October 1, and then the approval process will follow the same that the first 6 took, correct?
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a motion.
BJ, can you repeat what we're voting on, please?
The motion is to approve the 6 vendors and the funding formula and extend the window through October 1. Okay,
So this is the original motion, and is this, again, I just want to be clear, is this for vendors that previously submitted, or is this for any vendor that?
any vendor that would
Okay.
like to submit.
Thank you for the.
and just for a point of clarity, the money can go out because we're approving the distribution of the funds as presented.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
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 No.
Aye.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Moving on to discussion, IDOE Foster Youth Remediation Plan.
Morning.
Good morning.
I like it when my turn is still in the morning. I welcome the new board members. My name is Robin LeClaire. I'm the Director of School Improvement for the Indiana Department of Education. I'm here today to discuss the foster remediation plan as foster youth falls under the purview of school improvement. As per statute, on April the 1st, a foster report from the State Board of Education in collaboration with the Indiana Department of Education and the Department of Child Services regarding the educational outcomes of foster youth was due and released. That statute further called for a remediation plan to be submitted by the Indiana Department of Education by June the 30th. After the April 1 release of the report, the Indiana Department of Education, in keeping with our longstanding approach of inclusivity, reached out to stakeholders and agencies who have a connection with and impact on foster youth in Indiana. This involved those who participated in the April board meeting, as well as representatives from state board staff, state agencies, and individuals involved in the work with foster youth. In the plan, you will find that robust and diverse list of stakeholders involved and who gathered to begin work on this remediation plan. During our meeting with the stakeholder group, trends began to emerge. From that discussion, we identified really 5 buckets which need to be addressed in order to increase the educational outcomes and equity for this particular student group. If you've looked at the report, you will have noticed these 5 buckets are the issues that will require further study, issues that will require more training and clearer guidance from state agencies, issues that require resources, issues requiring legislation, and issues which may require a change in existing Indiana child serving systems. As a result of this meeting, the issues were identified and the commitment to including stakeholder input was also solidified. We intentionally created this remediation report to serve as a roadmap to guide us along continued work. It is a plan to craft a broader scope of work. And as a result of this meeting, we have committed to continuing this work with a sense of urgency with this coalition of stakeholders, which will expand, be fluid, and broken into subgroups based on the buckets being addressed. The goal is to flesh out the needed resources to adequately and thoroughly address each of the items identified in the report. These recommendations will be submitted to SISC. This is important work which requires immediate attention and a deep dive into the systemic issues which have gotten us here. This group is dedicated to making the changes necessary to facilitate foster youth success in Indiana. The end.
Your stakeholder group is super impressive. When you say meeting, was it a single meeting or was it a series of meetings?
We had a single meeting. As you can see in the list, it was a lot of people to get schedules together. We had between April 1 and June 30, but we really, to get a report together and due to you all takes some time, so we really didn't have till June 30. So we did just have the one meeting. We've now committed to meeting every other month. We have the platform using Doodle Poll out to all the stakeholders to get meetings together, and the first one should be at the end of this month.
And you'll be developing a plan during those meetings?
Exactly.
Because this is just bullet points.
This is bullet points. This is the roadmap to create a broader scope of work. So you're exactly right. The proceeding meetings that we will have will identify in these 5 buckets and address these bullet points. What are the action steps, the deadlines that will need to be met in order to address these particular issues?
And when do you think that plan will come to the board?
I don't know that that plan would come to the board. I believe that those recommendations will go to SISC. I could be wrong because I don't have legislation in front of me.
We don't approve the plan, but would you please share the plan with us once it's completed, obviously?
Certainly.
Okay. Yeah, but we don't,
Yeah.
in statute, we do not approve the plan. That's correct.
So the remediation plan anticipated by HB 1314 is still in development. Is that correct?
What I would say, the action items and the deadlines are still in development. The plan moving forward with the issues that we're going to address to increase educational outcomes for foster youth is this plan. It identifies the needs. I would say the action items and the deadlines are what are coming the timeline.
We heard Ken's concerns earlier, so we're agreeing that there's still a lot of work to do.
Absolutely, and I think that I had an opportunity to speak to Mr. Kent after he made his comments, and I don't want to speak for him. Is he still here? I don't want to speak for him, but I think we're on the same page of the mission that we're headed towards, and that we do need to have specific action items and deadlines, and that this is the stakeholder group that can make that happen.
Like Brent's working with the department on this?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Forward?
Yes, yes. And all of those stakeholders in that list, when we came together and created this bulleted list of issues, were then given a draft of the report. And I know Mr. Kent had some suggestions that we put in there, and we've been working with him and other agencies and DCS regarding those issues already moving forward so that we can have some dates. Most of you know my background because I've been in front of you before. Some of the new board members may not. I've been in public education for over 25 years now, 14 years as a classroom teacher and 10 years as a building administrator. So I've worked with foster youth for 25 years, for a quarter of a century. I've been involved with students being taken away from families, being reunited with families. I've had students come to me less than 12 hours after being taken from their family and trying to assimilate them into another culture. I understand the importance of this work, the number of students we're talking about, and what it means to the state of Indiana. We can do better, we will do better, we must do better. This is a beginning point. This is a systemic issue that's taken decades to create. I think that we would have been ill-advised to come to you with a silver bullet after only 3 months between the report and a remediation plan. I hope that you appreciate that the thoughtfulness that needs to go in to addressing this issue and actually creating results will take time, but we are committed to this work. We have a group of stakeholders who, including Mr. Kent, will push us forward at every moment.
Can you point to some things that will be better in the 1920 school year based on what's been done so far?
Some things that I hope will be more immediate than others would be some of the protocols and procedures in our schools, in our LEAs, for when foster students come, how those are reported, how we assimilate those students in, how we track their progress. That's something I'm hoping in the 1920 school year that's going to be happening immediately. I know that Dr. Keller, along with some of the stakeholders and DCS, are working on the data piece, the data sharing, and making sure that we have accurate data so that we can move forward using data to inform our decision making. So those are two things I would say are the most immediate changes that I would like to see. One of the things that I'm pleased about in our stakeholder group is we've intentionally included foster parents, people who are foster parents and who've seen some of the concerns, who brought concerns to the table that we hadn't even thought of. So I'm hoping some of those things for foster parents and how we get their voice to the table will be another thing right away in 1920 that'll make changes.
And you mentioned data. It seems that there's some discrepancy, like what the media said, what you've seen. Do you feel, or, I mean, where are we on that piece, right?
Yeah, so that's a complex piece, and Dr. Keller will take another shot up here probably with that. You know, some of the issues have to do with those protocols and procedures when students are enrolled at schools and how they're reported. As foster students, some of them have to do with students going to private schools. Foster parents can put those students in private schools and those may not be reported. Some of the issues have to do with school ages and those things. So we're trying to clean up that data and the data sharing. And if you need specifics on that, I know Dr. Keller would be happy to.
So is that cleaning up, Dr. Is that just based on procedural of what's causing that? Because you see one set of numbers and then you see that and it's like there's a discrepancy there.
Yeah, so, a couple pieces of background on that. So the business owner for foster care data would be DCS. Okay, that is their program. They collect all of that data. They have protocols that I believe require them to notify schools within certain timeframes, all that sort of thing. So I think there are some questions about what is the actual list of students in foster care at any time during a particular time box. That's the list that I want to see and haven't seen yet, and that's not because there's been any lack of cooperation. It's just like the universe of who is in foster care and is school age is actually a little more nuanced than it sounds like it should be. Anyway, so that's sort of point one. Point two is that schools, for the first time last year, reported foster care data to us. And you can imagine the potential bottlenecks in that chain of reporting, right? So we're getting schools reporting participation in foster care, and we have them report that in the spring, but our guidance specifically to schools is if a student has at any time during the school year been enrolled in foster care, because that is also a fluid program participation, you need to report them on this report. So when we first were preparing the data, the outcome data, we had about 7,500 students who got reported to us from schools. And again, since we're not the actual owners of the foster care program, we called up DCS and said, so, we have 7,500 students here. Is that a good number? And at that particular time, they said, we were thinking the number should be more like 9,000. So we're like, oh, well, how do we remedy this? So for a long time, we've been receiving data from DCS that on a monthly basis to help us provide schools information about who should be getting free and reduced lunch. Because that's called direct certification. The idea is if you're already in a categorically eligible federal program or state program for free and reduced lunch, why would you have to fill out the paperwork a second time? So DCS gives us that data on a monthly basis. The tricky thing about that data is there's not a shared unique identifier between the data that they're sending to us and the data we get from the schools. In other words, we have to create a matching process, and we have a matching process in place which we've used for years, because in order for us to tell schools, hey, here's a kid who you say you're serving who is actually already participating in this categorically eligible program, we have to match them on first name, last name, county, date of birth, all that sort of thing. So we ran the whole list of students that are enrolled in Indiana schools, regardless of whether schools reported them as being in foster care, against that data, and came up with about 1,500 more students. I think the number in the report is 9,076 students. So what I have confidence about there is that we used all available means to derive that number. What I don't have confidence about is whether, I would make no representation that 9,076 is all of the foster care students being served in Indiana schools. To Robin's point, there could be lots of reasons why a school isn't reporting, why perhaps a student is in a situation where they're not in a school that reports to us. So anyway, I think the go-forward strategy here is we'll work with DCS to get the universe of data that they believe should be showing up in a school. We'll keep asking schools. But the good thing about the schools reporting to us is there's no ambiguity around the unique identifier. They're saying this student is a foster student, and then we have their test data if they took the test, and we don't have to wonder if this kid matches this kid, all right? But we're gonna do an all of the above strategy. So we'll take that universe of data that we're getting from DCS, we'll look at what schools sent. We'll also match against what DCS sent. And then we're going to talk about the delta. And we'll say, well, so we didn't, let's just make out of it. Let's say it's 15,000 students, our school age, and we come up with 9,076 again next year, just theoretical. Then we're going to have to do some sampling. We'll say, okay, pick 100 kids that we didn't match or were not reported to us. Let's put them on a map. Let's do a heat. Let's put them out geographically. Let's figure out if there are pockets of these students who are not getting reported, because the reasons for us not knowing about them are, a mile high. But we're going to have to examine that delta between the universe and who's actually reported to schools, and we'll figure it out. I mean, and whittle that down so the delta is either not as large or we have what the community would all agree is satisfactory explanations about why the delta exists, because we may not be able to, close that gap entirely, but we're committed to making sure that we get as many kids as we possibly can. That help?
So serving foster children, this is just one example of issues where it's kind of an education issue, kind of a social services issue. I see a lot of opportunity here for you to establish those connections with DCS and the stakeholders and so forth. I do appreciate you acknowledging that this plan needs a lot of fleshing out and needs some meat on the bones. Do we have some type of expected time frame when we can revise plan?
The last part of the report does give a timeline for some goals that we have to address certain parts of these buckets and when they can be addressed. If you're talking about like, when would I come back to the state board to present something that has more actionable items and timelines, I would say, if we're going to meet every other month, we're talking about probably six to 8 months. And to your point about collaborating with other state agencies, I think right now we have a great relationship with DCS. We have a great relationship with many state agencies. CISC does a good job of bringing some of those things together. So right now I think we are in a prime place to do some of these things and have that collaboration be as productive as it has ever been in Indiana.
Any other questions?
I appreciate your time. Have a great day.
Thank you. Assessment update?
So I had a couple things that I wanted to update the board on this month. Most specifically, I know as part of the consent agenda this morning, we noted the request regarding IREAD 3 and wanted to provide an update about some conversations that have been going on with TAC in relationship to, again, some efficiency in our assessment system. So as I pointed out a few moments ago, as we're approaching Indiana assessments going forward, what we want to be most mindful of is coherence, our theory of action, and efficiency. One aspect of our system that is challenged with efficiency is the administration of IREAD 3 specifically. When we built iLearn, we wanted to be most thoughtful at that time about any transitions that could come about as part of building a new assessment. And with the stability that IREAD 3 has had over time since 2010, we have a very reliable scale, and we also have consistency in terms of how students have performed over time. And so with transitioning to iLearn, we engaged TAC in considering some options regarding IREAD 3 going forward. Most specifically, if we can gather some specific details on iLearn about a minimum threshold of reading comprehension that would alleviate the additional burden for a population of students to not have to additionally take IREAD 3 as well. So in grade 3 reading, in terms of the content of the assessment, iLearn does assess reading comprehension, both in terms of literary texts and informational texts. IREAD 3, additionally, in terms of its test blueprint, also lends itself to assessing some of those foundational components of early literacy. If students are meeting a certain threshold on iLearn, we would assert, and we can analyze, that they have attained a minimum threshold of reading standard that we believe would be appropriate. So in the conversations with TAC and with AIR, who is our vendor for IREAD 3, we are going to do some analysis this year to essentially determine through a regression analysis where that point of confidence might be that if a student attains a certain scale score on iLearn, that they would not have to take IREAD 3 additionally. In other words, they have attained that reading indicator of being successful. So to date, we haven't established that threshold yet. What we plan to do is both psychometric analysis with our vendor and with our technical advisory committee. And then additionally, we would like to convene some educator panels as well. The educator panels would be coming in to look at that psychometric placement of the threshold and reaffirm that proficiency of reading has in fact been met by where the data implies that threshold to be placed. So there will be lots of things that will be going on throughout the course of this year to move that conversation forward. A couple of points that have come up just logistically as we have thought about this model is when iRead 3 potentially could be given. So obviously, if we want to use iLearn to build in some efficiency, iLearn would need to be given first, and then iRead 3 would then follow. We've also had some questions about if some of the policy or good cause exemptions or retests would be structured differently. In short, at this point, I don't think that would need to significantly change. In essence, if a student based on their iLearn performance needed to take iRead 3 as a confirmation of their reading proficiency, they would still be offered the summer retest. They would still be offered those retest opportunities in grade 4 and 5. And obviously, we would want them to continue to receive remediation as well. Those good cause exemptions would continue to be in place as well, but we would want the student to continue to attempt iRead 3 that first time, at least until that case conference committee convenes to make that determination. So I wanted to present some of that work that is underway, some of those discussions and analysis to present to the board just so that you had context about some efficiencies that may exist in the future for your consideration.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, sir.
And Charity, I really like this work, okay? But you know my question I'm going to ask, because I think back to when we were doing the iLearn committee work, and from educators saying, above all, as late as possible in the year, one window, right? So forget the one window thing for a minute. But with this, do you anticipate that we would have to back up the start date for iLearn because of needing to do, do you have any feel for that yet?
In short, I don't anticipate a significant impact. And the main reason why is if you think about iRead 3 right now, we have around 85% of students that are passing iRead 3 annually. So we're talking about potentially a very small population that would have to engage in that additional assessment. Again, we haven't set what that threshold would be yet, and it's not going to be near 85%. But we would have a very small group potentially that would have to engage in that assessment. And iRead 3 as a whole takes about 90 minutes to administer it. So in relationship to iLearn, it's a very brief test as well.
Okay. But you don't think you would need to make iLearn start that much earlier or if at all because of the small group, right?
No,
Okay.
no. And the other efficiency that we would have just in terms of test administration itself is the interface for deployment would be the same one as iLearn. So some of those things that we're doing separately now with administering a practice test and cycling students through all of those exercises to get used to the testing environment, if they're testing both of those things within the same window, then that would also be minimized as well.
Thank you very much.
I want to
Oh,
follow
I'm
up
sorry.
with that, because right now we take iLearn right there at the 1st of March. We get the results, we can identify kids to remediate during the summer and then take it again. We take the iLearn test in May, and this year for our district, we got done with testing, we had 4 days and school was over. So I now don't have those kids identified to help during summer school to give them assistance as they get ready to become 4th graders, which we've said the iRead 3 exam says you're really struggling in some comprehension things, that 4th grade work is going to be tough. When do you think I would get the results of that testing information to help those kids?
So the way that we're tracking in the contract delivery, both for iLearn and iRead 3, is iLearn in 2020, the results are scheduled to be delivered within 12 days of student submission of the assessment. So there likely needs to be some sort of thoughtfulness around the testing schedule, particularly in grade 3 for English language arts. So it may be that in grade 3 English language arts, that becomes the first test that everyone gives to promote getting that retest opportunity most quickly, or for iRead 3. And then for iRead 3, those results are within 24 hours. We actually have the capability potentially to abbreviate that even more so, but that 24-hour period allows for our additional data verification.
Caution you that a lot of that 15% are my EL kids, and I need to identify them to help them during the summer, and need to be able to have something as a roadmap to help them improve those skills.
Yes,
That
sure.
group of students.
Any other questions?
Purpose of iRead 3 is to ensure that all learners in Indiana can read by the end of third grade, which research shows that's pretty critical stage to move on to grade 4. It's difficult if students can't read. And if we go down this path, then are you saying that the iLearn will also ensure at a greater level that students can read? So we're not giving up anything with that purpose that we have. We're enhancing it, is that correct?
Yes. For those students that likely fall into the area where we're less confident about their reading ability, we actually would then have an additional data point. So they would be receiving both iLearn and iRead 3 scores in absence of just iLearn itself. So we're not really losing data for those that would be considered at greatest risk. And again, we are being very mindful of where that indicator should be placed. So one conversation that TAC advised as well is that that threshold could become more conservative over time. It may adjust over time based on data that we're seeing and how things actually play out once it's implemented. So in the first few years, we could be very cautious about when students are actually taking iRead 3, but initially, we would want to be most thoughtful. And TAC has been very helpful in guiding this conversation, and I appreciate their work on that.
Mentioned historically, 15% of students who take iRead 3 do not pass it, and 15%, I would think, is thousands of students who can't read at the end of grade 3. And when I pursued this in the past, because I think the statute says they can't go on to grade 4 and other kinds of things, and there's been all kinds of exceptions and flexibility and so forth. So what do we do in this new system? If a student does not pass the iLearn, then they're going to take the iRead 3. And what happens if they don't pass the iRead 3?
So the same guidance that we currently have is what we've discussed to date. Obviously, we have some time to revisit that as well. But essentially, this model would function where the student would sit and participate in English language arts for iLearn upon their schedule. Within 12 days of reporting, they likely would receive 2 data points. They would receive a data point around that reading indicator in addition to their iLearn score. Depending on what that reading indicator informs, if they have not attained that reading threshold, then those students would participate in iRead 3 during that same spring window. If they are not successful on iRead 3 in the spring, then they would continue to retest in the summer. If they're not successful in the summer, they would continue to have those retest opportunities as well. Again, the good cause exemptions exist for students that meet that criteria. Remediation is always expected locally to address that as well.
I think we have to talk about that policy decision, what happens, because I don't want to penalize anyone, but we penalize all students who don't pass it over and over and over again, and then they leave school because they're unsuccessful, because they can't read, or they get to graduation and can't read. And I know it's only 15% is thousands, as I said before. And I think we do a disservice unless we ensure from a policy perspective. So I'm looking for a balance somehow of ensuring that every student can read, because if they can't, they're not going to be successful. And we can do research about what happens to those students. I will bet you there's a high correlation between those students who do not pass IRE 3 and later on those students who drop out because they're frustrated in school.
Sure.
So, we all want to be nice people, but at some point, we're going to have to really look at that and make a policy decision that is enforced. Right now, we have a law that's not being enforced. Students go on and on and on and on and on, and then I get a call from a parent saying, my child's graduating this week from high school, and she can't read.
Yes.
It's not going to be 100%, but we need to really look at that and maybe take a leadership position on it. So that was sort of an editorial. I'm not looking for a response.
Yes, and
But if you
our
can share that with the committee.
Yeah, and our intent is not to minimize the expectation for reading. We are simply trying to ensure some efficiency, if it exists, for the number of tests and minutes of tests that students are participating in.
Thank you very much.
I did
Now
want to note one other quick update around the procurement process for the college entrance examination. So I wanted to note that we will begin drafting that very soon. So our intent is to begin drafting that in our office for the first few weeks of August. We will start including some advisory groups in September. Currently, we had slated for the state board to receive the draft of that RFP scope of work the last part of September, and then review that hopefully at the October board meeting.
So then that would mean that process would happen with that timeline. When would we, remind me how long that takes and what that.
Sure. So in terms of if we were bringing that to you in October, that would mean that the release would occur with IDOA soon thereafter. I would suspect that in terms of contract negotiation and execution, it could happen around the first part of the year.
First part of the year.
2020.
That we know what that is, right? Okay. I just think it's important because our freshmen that start here in a few days, that is their test, or going to be their test.
And we were planning to implement the process very similarly to what we did with iLearn. So we're going to involve educators in that process, just knowing the high stakes associated with that.
Thank you very much. Now we have discussion item E, Theodore Roosevelt Edison Innovation Network School Budgets.
So pursuant to the Innovation Network Agreement between Edison and Roosevelt, they're required to submit a budget to the state board. We're just simply asking that the board acknowledge receipt of this budget. Mr. Sandlin acknowledged some concerns here, so we're going to continue to work with them to try to get this in a little bit better shape around the non-instructional costs in the budget. So we're just asking that the board acknowledge receipt, and we'll move forward.
So this is not us taking an action, giving an endorsement. This is literally just acknowledging receipt of the budget.
Correct.
Any questions about that from board members?
The state is not signatory in any way to that agreement. That's between the school district and Edison Learning.
So Brian, do you need a motion to acknowledge receipt?
No.
Nothing, it's been received. With that, anything else from board members? Motion and second to adjourn, those in favor? Aye. Aye. We stand adjourned.